Hey there, my name is Julia Zimmermann and I'm the Research Fellow at the Chair of Economics. And today I'm going to present you my current working paper or project, Enemy Within the Gates, Evidence from Stalin's Ethnic Cleansing Campaigns. So this lecture will be more or less an animated podcast, so feel free to relax and lay back and just listen. So I'm going to present you first the historical case, state of the art. I will discuss you how I formulated my hypothesis, data, methodology, as well as go into the results and conclusion of my empirical investigation. So as this is a empirical paper, so you're going to encounter a bit more math. So however, I'm trying to make it as digestible as possible. So let us start. So I'm going to investigate Stalin's ethnic cleansing campaigns, which describes a period between 1937 and 1945 in which 9 ethnic groups were forcefully removed from their homelands. And in each case, the entire population was relocated to Siberia, Asia, or both. So with the German invasion, the Soviet leadership immediately deported 1.2 million ethnic Germans from European Russia and Central Asia. Following the retreat of the German army in 1943 and 1944, the Soviet state deported its entire Crimean Tatar, Kalmyk, Chechen, Ingush, Balkar, Karachay, and Meskhetian Turk populations from Crimea and the Transcaucasus to Central Asia on the charge of collective treason. So this constitutes actually an empire that changed its mind with respect to the former nation policies that it actually pursues during the 1920s. So effective on January 8th, 1945, the USSR actually placed the USSR leadership placed legal restrictions on residency and movement of members of these ethnic groups, and they were now called special settlers. They required them to engage in socially useful labor and mandated the NKVD and so-called combinaturas, or commandments, to organize the labor arrangements of the deportees. That means finding and placing deportees in jobs. So it further restricted their movements by banning special settlers from leaving their assigned settlements without permission of the NKVD, and required the head of all special settler families to notify their special commandment within 3 days of all births, deaths, escapes, and other changes that would affect the status of the immediate settler family. Finally, it was required that special settlers had to obey all orders from their special commandment, granting them the power to punish violation that were now considered a crime equal to escapes. And they were punished from either a fine up to 100 rubles or incarceration up to 5 days. So based on continuous escapes by special settlers from their assigned places, so the Soviet government passed on a decree on November 26 in 1948 and made their settlement to be forever. And that leaving their assigned places of the settlement would be punished by 20 years of hard labor compared to a previous sentence of 8 years. It mentioned specifically the Chechens, Karachay, Ingush, Balkar, Kalmyks, Germans, and Crimean Tatars as subject to these measures. Moreover, any free citizen helping fugitive settlers will face 5 years prison terms, which made the fate of the deportees even darker. On the next slide, I show you the timing of the deportation campaigns. We see that the timing of the deportation actually started in 1937 with the deportation of the Koreans from the Far East Krai, so on the border with the Japanese Empire, into Central Asia, followed by the Germans, with the advancement of the German Wehrmacht starting in 1939, and following September 1943, the deportation of the Karachay. So it ended with the Meskhetian Turks, who were in the numbers of 90,000 deported to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, or Kyrgyzstan in November 1944. On the next slide, I show you the change in the settler population within the borders of 1939. On this slide, you see two chloropleth maps. On the left-hand side, you see the distribution of the punished peoples, like these 9 ethnicities, at the moment of their departure in 1939. On the right-hand side, you see the distribution of the special settler population in the host regions in 1959. What you see, basically, and should take away from these two graphs, is that on the left-hand side, the distribution was predominantly in European Russia and also on the eastern borders, close to the Japanese Empire. So from the right-hand side, you should see that basically all the previously dark blue areas actually turned lighter blue, and that Central Asia, which was light blue before, actually turned very dark blue. So on the next slide here, I inform you about the rehabilitation. So, because only after the death of the people's father Stalin in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev, his successor, initiated a process of reinstating social and political rights for some of the deportees. This is the so-called rehabilitation process. And this period of from 1953 to 1964 is known in Soviet history as Khrushchev Thaw. So, in a secret speech at the 20th Communist Party Congress, he called deportation mass repression and recognized that the deportation action was not dictated by any military consideration. So concerning the role of the special settlers, only 5 deported ethnic groups benefited, which were the Chechen, Ingush, Balkar, Karachay, and Kalmuks. So in 1956, these 5 ethnic groups were restored in their political rights, their administrative autonomy was reestablished, and government return assistance was implied. So it is not clear why only 5 out of these 9 groups have been reestablished, or basically have been rehabilitated. However, evidence suggests that they were not of strategic importance at the time of the rehabilitation decree. So as for the Germans, who were the largest deported group, it would have been, for instance, extremely difficult to relocate them back, and moreover, they were needed for development purposes. So Germans, Crimeans, Meskhetian Turks, and Koreans were forced to remain in their destination right until the Soviet Union disintegrated and were subject to more or less ostracization. So on the next slide, I show you a similar picture as before, but this picture now defines the change in the unrehabilitated settler population within 1939 borders. Here again, you see that they were on the left-hand side at their departure in 1939, mostly in European Russia, and on the right-hand side in the host region of 59. So here you see, if you compare we can see that the pattern of the deported people is actually predominantly driven by the share of unrehabilitated settler. So on the next slide, I will introduce you to our economic universe that we are going to build on. So this economic universe is actually a table of important studies in this research cluster. So studies investigating the forced migration on employment are hard to find, as these precludes the availability of reliable data. One such rare example is Murad and Zakhali, who exploit the resettlement of 1.2 million Greeks from Turkey to Greece after the Greco-Turkish War from 1919 to 1922. They find a positive effect of the inflow of migrants on long-run economic outcomes. Municipalities with a larger influx of refugees after 1923 exhibit higher household wealth, more educational attainment, and higher levels of earnings almost 7 decades later. Their results are driven by a larger financial and manufacturing sector and support the agglomeration effects that led specialization and knowledge inflow. Additionally, the paper of Alex Garcia Walker analyzed the case for Kenya, where refugees were not allowed to work. So this is similar to these socially mandated labor. The authors document an increased demand for agricultural and livestock products in the host areas, which translated actually into higher economic activity and consumption in these regions. Another possible scenario of a, for instance, positive net effect of migrant influx is when displaced migrants are actually substantially more skilled than the local population. One such modern example constitutes the expulsion of Jewish scientists from Nazi Germany who advanced innovation and patenting in the US. Moser and co-authors use inventor-level data and document that these Jewish scientists actually spurred inventions and patents in chemistry. They did so not by increasing the productivity of incumbent inventors, but by attracting scientists to their field. So in a similar study, Waldinger in 2010, who was a professor at the University of Munich, he adds further evidence to the expulsion of Jewish academics from German universities. The author documents significant drops in faculty quality among universities' mathematics department, from which Jewish scientists were removed from. He uses data on mathematics PhD students between 1923 and 1938 and proves that early-stage scholars were less likely to publish their dissertation or to be promoted to full professorship. Moreover, they also had lower lifetime citations. A study that is closest to mine is actually the study of Tarek Hassan and Darren Acemoglu, who provide further evidence on the long-term legacies of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union and investigate the variation both within oblasts occupied by the Nazis and across occupied and non-occupied oblasts, and show that oblasts in which the Holocaust most severely reduced the size of the middle class have worse political and economic outcomes today. These oblasts grew less since 1945, both in terms of population and GDP per capita, and they exhibited greater vote shares for communist candidates during the 1990s, and also supported more for the preservation of the Soviet Union in the referendum held in 1991. So let us summarize the results for a moment. So where are we right now? So we have two regions with severe alterations of the social fabric. So one experienced a population collapse, this is the region of origin, and the other experienced a migration shock. This is the region of destination, right? We have also the temporal variation in the rehabilitation status. So only for some ethnicities, these restrictions in movement and free labor choice have been lifted. And we have also the continued exposure to violence that takes its toll on intergenerational investment decisions and social identities. So these investment decisions could actually be subgrouped into three distinct areas. These are education, labor market choices that actually also define the social strata, and finally, political attitudes and behavior. So in this area, or basically in this paper, I consider the period of the entire existence of the Soviet Union. I have to emphasize this, as this guarantees that all regions are subject to the same communist treatment. I also organized the exposure to the Stalinist ethnic cleansing campaigns into a distinct pre-treatment and post-treatment group, where the pre-treatment defines a period before 1939 and the post-treatment the one after 1953. It has to be emphasized that in the case of state-led forcibly resettlement, dimensions of violence are rarely clear observable in the pre-treatment. So this is mostly the result of data availability and reliability, which might also be tied to the treatment itself. So just keep that in mind. We continue with a quick summary of where we are right now. So Building upon prior research on the effect of state-led violence, I expect that violence experienced by first and second generation settlers, like those who themselves were deported as well as their direct descendants, have impacted contemporary political attitudes, the importance attached to property and social class, and finally the preference for education. My argument rests on the assumption that it is not necessary to be impacted by violence when you consider the exposure, right? So on the contrary, violence against members of a community might impact the beliefs and behaviors of others who were not directly victimized. So this seems plausible, as the Soviet government selected its targets based on collective criterion, which is the ethnic identity and where the victims lived, such that it does not seem unreasonable to me, actually, to assume that a community that lost a great share of its populations to the deportation campaigns and who were not directly impacted by this violence were nonetheless affected by it economically and politically. As a result, I expect the effects of state-sponsored forced resettlement to affect not only the deported in the regions of destination, but also the stayers in the regions of origin. On a generational timescale, one of the consequences of community-led exposure to indiscriminate violence is then the shared belief in a common enemy or threat that drives collective identity. On the one hand, I thus assume that the effects of state-sponsored forced resettlement violence will persist across generations, which is consistent with studies of the historical legacies, but with the locus of transmission being the family. On the other hand, theories of intergenerational transmission highlight that the family often competes with other sources of socialization, such as formal education or social groups. I therefore also expect that the legacies of violence to be transmitted through the family, and that these legacies actually will diminish across generations. On the next slide, I will introduce you further to the argument that I'm making for the social strata, the education, and political behavior. So, a first key lesson of economic theory is that the impact of migration hinges crucially on the degree of substitutability between new arrivals and natives. So if settlers and natives were substitutes and compete against each other, a forced migration shock may lead to an increased supply of workers and thus an increased competition for the available jobs. The historical case tells us, however, that settlers most likely did not compete in the same labor market as the natives, as a settler had to engage in socially meaningful labor. To the extent that labor is also an important input to production, the increase of population could also lead to an increase in demand for new products and encourage enterprising natives to start different trade business. Both arguments are good candidates for me that would rationalize higher levels of white-collar employment, mostly driven by an occupational upgrading of natives and an increase in the demand for products. Therefore, I expect a short to medium run increase in the level of white-collar employment in the receiving regions. As regards the blue-collar employment, numerous studies suggest that networks are likely to play an important role in providing access to informal labor markets and credit in an informal economy. So, in such a setting, potential gains from forcibly displaced are certainly negative for the settlers, as they were stuck in location in which their occupational mix was not suited for the talents acquired in the sending regions. In the receiving regions, the settlers further had to overcome language, proficiency barriers, cultural barriers, discrimination, lack of experience in the local labor market, and the recognition of skills and qualification. I therefore expect the blue-collar employment to that the impact of the supply shock to supersede the high displacement costs, which results into a higher aggregate employment in the host regions. The regions of origin, in contrast, now suffer from an excess demand for labor and from a loss of important inputs to production, specifically manufacturing and farming and production. On the other hand, due to a long shared history and a more liberal occupational choice in pre-war, Russia, stayers and settlers were closer to substitutes than complements, such that positions formerly held by settlers are now more attractive for stayers. On the other hand, the loss of labor force results in a substantially decreased demand for products. I therefore expect blue and white collar employment to decrease in the short to medium run in the regions of origins. In the long run, I expect a labor reallocation effect to mitigate the demand and supply shock triggered by the removal of the settlers in the regions of origins that are offset with the settler arrival in the host regions. The long-run behavior in the destination then crucially depend on whether settlers assess their physical assets to be secure from government expropriation and, more importantly, how they ensure themselves against further negative shocks. So in descending regions, it's plausible to assume that training and education might offset the negative short-run impacts in the long run, such that I expect the development of white-collar employment to be tied closely to the human capital investment decisions of the stayers and natives and the settlers themselves in the regions they were transferred in or from which they came. On the next slide, I will further rationalize the education argument. So, considering education is relevant as the forced migration shock could affect the intergenerational transmission of human capital, including both agricultural and non-agricultural capital, as the exposure to violence might disrupt schooling and reduces the enrollment among school-aged children. So there are several mechanisms through which this could occur. So the study of Hassan and Acemoglu show, for instance, for the Russian oblasts that experienced the Holocaust more intensely, that they have grown less and exhibit also a reduced level of education. So this could be related to a shift in preferences, for instance, in the settler population towards education, which is a more portable asset and away from physical assets. I argue that education does serve as partial insurance against negative shocks, as forced migration or having a family history of the same may affect the probability that individuals attach to future migration. Following a high degree of uncertainty about the individual settlers group's rehabilitation status might have induced settlers to invest more in human capital. So, as I said, there are several mechanisms through which this could occur. For instance, settlers and their descendants could attach a higher subjective probability to being delivered to fate, which would be observable in additional individual level data on saving and insurance and religious participation. However, these data I do not have, that's why I only can argue this theoretically. So, moreover, being victimized could have made the settlers less myopic and more willing to invest in education, and they could have changed their valuation for education per se, and now have higher aspirations for the education of their descendants relative to their own. Finally, a lack of access to local land resources could have led special settlers to opt for education instead, in order to get access to non-agricultural jobs. Anecdotal evidence from the historical case presupposes a change in the beliefs about property rights towards a persistent higher preferences for education. So, closing in on the long-run employment argument I made before, I expect the increase in human capital acquisition to occur at the disadvantage of employment, as I assume that the settlers do see their physical assets less secure. That's why they do not go in white-collar positions. As regards the regions of origins, and assuming that the excess demand does not supersede the good shock, I expect secondary and tertiary education in the sending regions to negatively respond to the decreased demand of white and blue-collar positions. On the next slide, I will introduce you to the argument I make about the political behavior. So, since Stalin's ethnic cleansing campaigns were mostly political in their intended effects, I investigate changes in the behavioral effects of political participation, such as vote or abstain from voting, or protest and not protest. I expect that inherited political identities do inform contemporary political attitudes and behaviors of the descendants of the punished people. So parents may directly socialize some specific political attitudes and behaviors in their children, but most of the socialization effect is likely indirect and mediated through the transmission of identities. So this is more likely when the political context changes, as it did dramatically for the punished people in the receiving regions of Central Asia. Political engagement, for instance, was all but irrelevant for the first and second generation settlers themselves living in Central Asia. As again data are missing, I theorize that the exposure to violence might have induced them to identify more strongly with their ethnic group, and as victims instilled more acute fear of possible future threats, thereby deterring any expression of political dissent. But for their grandchildren, inherited ethnic identity likely produces political participation as a defense mechanism. So I anticipate that the intergenerational effects of violence on political identities in turn shape the contemporary attitudes and behaviors of descendants. I expect this effect to be more pronounced in the regions of destinations than in the regions of origins. So the next slide summarizes the hypothesis put forth in the previous 3 slides and in a more table. I will not go into detail in these schematics since I already argued in the 3 slides before. However, I think this is a nice summary for you to read up on later. So the contribution that I intend to do with my paper is I analyze the hitherto unstudied forced relocation campaigns of Soviet citizens of enemy ethnicity who were forcefully removed from their region of origin and sent to the destination, which rendered their previous acquired human capital and income path worthless. My project differs from the studies, for instance, of Tarek Hassan and Acemoglu, as it considers the one-sided strategic aggression against civilians as a military instrument of a totalitarian regime, and this is an episode not yet discovered in the economics discipline. So my project does not only consider the long-run effects of a population collapse that affects the economic well-being in the sending regions, as Tarek Hassan and Acemoglu did, but sets in comparison an artificial alteration of the social structure in the destination regions of Central Asia and Siberia. It is these regions that actually have been neglected in the economic research, which predominantly considers Eastern Europe and European Russia as their research target. Third, I break grounds by studying the long-term effects of state-led relocation campaigns several generations later, which will be relevant to policymaking considering large waves of internal and internationally forced displacement around the world. Finally, I consider combinations of different types of spatial lag models and test the model specification against one another and determine the significance of regional spillover. So the significance of regional spillover effects and spatial lags, these are concepts that I will explain on the next slides to you. So spatial and temporal comparability of units, this is what we need. However, we have 2 major challenges to overcome. The first challenge is the numerous and massive border shifts within the last 100 years. So therefore, I use borders of 1939, which is the smallest extension of the USSR. I also use regions that are consistently reported from 1939 through 1989. I also account for neighborhood relations and spillovers that might affect the argument which has been made by Morgan Kelly 2 years ago. The second challenge to overcome is the social engineering, the population collapse, you name it. So basically the everyday violence through communistic rule, which affects basically economic activity and also attitudes and behaviors. On the next slide, I will show you our spatial level playing field, which is the administrative division of the USSR in 1939. So here you see the map of the administrative division based on the World Atlas of 1937. The book 2 actually depicts the map of 1939. So this is our geographical level playing field. So on the next slide, I will introduce you to the main data sets that I use for producing this output that I will show you in a couple of slides. So the first is the number, the location, and ethnic structure of the special settlers, right? So we need them by host regions, and I obtained this from the historian Viktor Zemskov, who wrote a very interesting book about the special settlers. I use this data as per January 1st, 1953, the year in which the special settler system reached its zenith, and obtain a cross-section sample on the number of special settlers split by ethnicities in 121 oblasts and independent republics, of which 79 hosted special settlers. I also need data on the region of origin at their departure. For this, in order to determine the region of origin, I rely on data provided by Pavel Polyan that I supplement with USSR census data from 1939 and information from Lorimer, who was a demographer in 1947. So in the supplement number 1 of Polyan's book, he provides an excellent information on the timing of their operation, the number of people of each ethnic groups, as well as their regions of departure. As the sending regions in Polyan are grouped, a single breakdown of ethnicities by administrative subdivision is only possible when cross-referenced with the distribution of the ethnicities per oblast as per the 1939 census, as well as with data from the aforementioned Lorimer, who provides a comprehensive list of ethnic groups, including their area of concentration, occupation, pre-Soviet tradition, and urbanization status. This is complemented by urbanization, pre-war ethnic split, social status, and education by oblasts that I take from the USSR census volumes, and also from Mordechai Altshuler, a Jewish historian who investigates the history of the Soviet Jews before the World War II and afterwards. Third, I use the number of protests and riots by city in the late Soviet Union used by Singer. Because I also have voting data on the referendum, but as voting is probably the best nonviolent means in an about-to-be democracy, it does not allow to assess how angry people actually were. So further, voting alone does not sufficiently capture distrust among the population in the electoral system, nor does it capture cases in which citizens are prevented from voting. Therefore, going to protest will be my second measure of political dissent against the central government. On the next slide, I will show you other factors of everyday violence in the Soviet Union. So these other factors are actually the altered economic geography in the Soviet Union caused by the occupation of regions and cities by the German Wehrmacht. The advancement of the German Wehrmacht was associated with severe losses such as the destruction of infrastructure and capital. To my knowledge, neither data on the wartime losses by a city or region exist, and probably never will, nor information on the reconstruction efforts of the regions and cities to restore destroyed infrastructure exist. I therefore can only reconstruct simple countermeasures for capturing the war-related violence of World War II based on the location of the cities that were occupied and the length of occupation. Second, as the Soviet Union initiated a series of countermeasures, I collect data from Dexter and Rodionov on the number of defense factories and research facilities between 1922 and up to 2018. Their data set of which I use the version 21, has almost 33,000 entries of establishment that were used for military production during World War II, including ID, name, address, country, subordinates, superiors, as well as enterprises such as design, filial, and branch. So very detailed data set. So this information allows for coding according to the main branch of defense production. And for each region, I record the number of establishments in use for military production from 1922 to 1939 and from 1940 to 1959. In order to capture the degree of everyday violence, respectively, for the intimate connection of the ordinary citizens with prisoner population, I collect data from Smirnov that has been made publicly available by the Russian human rights organization Memorial. And this data provides information on the production, the number of inmates through time, its date of reestablishment, as well as its date of dissolution. On the next slide, I will show you the change in the size of the Jewish community. I already introduced you briefly the study of Hassan et al., so I thought it might make severe sense to actually include the drop in the Jewish community due to the mass murder of the Jews in order to control for educational effects here. This slide actually follows the same structure as before, and building upon the research on the economics of Judaism and the long history of the persecution of the Jewish community, I controlled for the change in the size of the Jewish community between 1939 and 1959 in order to capture potential adverse economic effects for the white-collar employment in response to the Holocaust. These effects exists if oblasts with a large Jewish community were systematically different from others, such that if they were, for instance, on average, more open-minded, entrepreneurial, better educated as a result of a longer history of persecution. So if these regions were indeed different, these particularities could translate into different paths of economic and political development. I therefore include this variable that should capture the share of the missing Jews in the respective oblasts based on the 1939 census volumes that I supplement with data from Mordechai Altschula. The next slide shows you a map of the other violent measure and control variables that I have in my data set. This map shows you European Russia, and as a legend tells you on the upper right corner, we have three symbols here to look at. We have in blue the Soviet defense facilities. We also have in red the cities occupied by the German Wehrmacht. And you see the Gulag labor camps dispersed also across Soviet European Russia that might affect our argument. On the next slide, I show you a table of the main correlates for the settler variable. So this table correlates the settler variable split by rehabilitation status to the post-war data set. Here, I want to focus you on column 2 and column 4 and compare both with column 3 and 5. So as you can see, the first column includes the variables in the data set, which includes the white-collar workers from 59 to 89, blue-collar workers, university graduates, high school graduates, voting outcome, Gulag camps, defense facility, as well as a measure for geographic location. Column 2 correlates the unrehabilitated settler with the post-war outcomes. What you see from column 2 is basically a positive correlation, except for the defense industry and latitude and longitude on the bottom. However, you also see a lot of asterisks. So the asterisk says that the correlation is highly significant, while 3 asterisks stand for a highly significant correlation between the unrehabilitated settler population and 39 with post-war variables. 2 says, two asterisks to say that this correlation is significant at the 5% level. So you only mistake by 5%. And the one asterisk says that this is significant at the 10% level. I want to draw your attention to column 2 versus column 4, and you see that not only the magnitude of the correlation actually drops, but also you see a lot of missing asterisks from before. For the rehabilitated settler in 1939, you see a not significant negative correlation, which increases considering column 5 in negative magnitude and sometimes also becomes significant. So to summarize, a first data inspection confirms my hypothesis that the stock of deported ethnicities and their rehabilitation status, especially the one of the unrehabilitated ethnicities as shown in column 2 and 4, does play a significant role for socioeconomic variables even decades later. On the next slide, I will introduce you to the construction of the ex ante and ex post indicators and how I did them. So on this slide, you see 4 indicators. You see indicator 1 and 2, which covers the unrehabilitated settlers. Indicator 3 and 4 actually covers the rehabilitated settlers. So all 4 indicators actually are the share of the unrehabilitated settlers, respectively the rehabilitated settlers in region I at time t and in sample region S. The sample region S constitutes then of origin and destination. Further, population with the subscript IT is the total population in region I in time t. By construction, these indicators are only positive for regions that sent or hosted this particular group. On the next hand slide, I will introduce you more to the methodology of spatial regression technique. So my approach addresses a recent contribution made by Morgan Kelly from Ireland, who finds that the majority of highly published papers investigating historical episodes and their impact on the long-run development are distorted due to spatially autocorrelated data that inflate the significant levels of the results. So this is important as several Gauss-Markov assumptions in non-spatial ordinary least square models, such that our error terms are distributed independently, are not satisfied. So if we do not consider this spatial autocorrelated data, we will have biased and inconsistent estimates if spatial dependencies occur in the dependent variables, or we have an unbiased or we have a biased and inefficient estimator when the spatial dependency occur in the error term. So the idea of Kelly goes back to the idea of Walter Tobler and his first law of geography. Everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related to distance things. So in general, basically, the relationships between regions depend on geographical, economic, and political distances between countries. So in the next slides, I will introduce you to the concept of spatial correlation, spatial autocorrelation, and briefly describe how I actually did this. So quickly said, correlation is a relationship between two quantitative variables. It can be positive, where a high value of one variable tends to go with a high value of the other. It could be negative. A high value of one variable tends to go with a low value of the other variable. The measure is the correlation coefficient. When we consider spatial autocorrelation, it says that the development of an object can be influenced by events in all other objects of the same total space. It can be also positive and negative. So as measures, we have the spatial correlation coefficient, which we can address by looking at the Moran's eye and by variograms, which is a spatial, which is a graphical representation. The next slide will introduce you to semi-variograms that show spatial correlation. So here a variogram investigates and quantifies the spatial variability of the phenomenon under study. From the variograms of the main dependent variables depicted here, the presence of spatial trends is confirmed, noticeable in the change of the vertical direction of the respective variogram. These trends persist over the entire areal extent of the study area and lead to a positive correlation even for large horizontal legs. This is true except for the sentiment-related variables, which is the protests. On the next slide, I will introduce you in how I defined a neighborhood matrix. So I need to define a weight matrix, which actually defines how a particular unit is related to all other units. This weight matrix must comply with multiple technical constraints that guarantee its inversibility. For instance, it is not possible to have only islands or zones that have no neighbors, or a model in which every region is every else's region neighbor. So it can be noted that these patterns of contiguousness do comply with these technical constraints. So I specified two symmetric contiguity weighting matrices based on the polygonized Atlas-Mira map that I showed you before. And I do subdivide this in two samples, which S denotes a sample of regions of origins and R the sample of the host regions. I have a total of 6 Soviet republics consistent of 148 administrative units that existed between 1922 and 1989. I further restrict my sample to administrative units that have been established before 1939 and consistently reported during the majority of the census volumes. So this leaves me with a final sample of 98 administrative or spatial units, of which 49 experienced a collapse in their settler population larger than 5%, and 49 an increase in the settler population. Further, I define bands, which I basically described before. These bands ensure the inversibility of each matrix. That means that basically every spatial unit has at least one neighbor. On the next slide, I show you the polygonized Atlas-Mira, where you see the sample of the sending and the receiving regions. You see, based on the recent settlers, in the link in the green link in the bottom area will show you back to the regions, but for the timing preferences here, I refrain from clicking this, but you can do it in your presentation at home. You see here in this figure 12 that on the borders the regions are orange. These are the sending regions, and the blue ones are the receiving regions. So, but this is not done yet. So on the next slide, I will show you what I have done additionally with these neighborhood matrices. In the second steps, I spectral standardize each of these units such that its largest eigenvalue equals to 1. So the spectral normalization ensures also non-singularity of each matrix and ensures or improves the estimability of the models. It further ensures that the mutual proportions between the elements of the sending sample and the receiving sample remain unchanged and allows for a solid economic interpretation. So I continue basically by characterizing the spatial autocorrelation, which means the degree, using graphical representation and statistical tests. So the next slide will introduce you to the measure of spatial correlation. So from this map, I can conduct a Moran test for global spatial autocorrelation, which would indicate misleading t-statistics. So under the null hypothesis of no global spatial correlation, we can basically interpret the values, right? So a value of I, which is basically larger than E, this indicates positive spatial autocorrelation, as nearby regions tend to exhibit similar values of other spatial units. So this null hypothesis just says that, in other words, I simply assume that the geographic location is exogenous, and I measure how one spatial unit is similar to the others surrounding it, while values closer to the lower bound of -1 basically indicate spatially dispersed data. Values closer to the upper bound of +1 indicate spatially correlated data. So values around 0 would thus indicate no spillovers, and this is actually something that we would like to have. But we will see that this is not the case here with our data. So these Martin values are further transformed into z-scores, for which values greater than 1.96 or smaller than 1.96 indicate spatial autocorrelation at the 5% significance level. Additionally, p-values suggest the statistical significance of the detected spatial dependence. Here you see the Moran's I for the host regions. As regards my data, I can reject basically the null of spatial independence in the sending and receiving regions. The results further suggest that the spatial dependence is more pronounced in the receiving regions than in the sending regions, observable in the magnitude of the z-score and the p-value. Hence, I argue that the distribution of high or low values in my data seem to be spatially more clustered than I would expect if the spatial process were random. So, however, I detected the presence of global spatial dependence. The Moran test does not allow or does not provide any information on the correct model specification. It just says, okay, there is a spatial autocorrelation. And on the next slide, I also show you the Moran's I for the host regions. However, I refrain from interpreting them. It's the same interpretation. You see that basically there is a degree of spatial autocorrelation. So, but what happens if we ignore spatial autocorrelation? This is discussed on the next slide. So if spatial correlation is present, I already told you quickly before that the ordinary least squares estimation can be biased and needs to be interpreted with caution. So I need to extend basically the linear regression by spatial lags. So basically there are three main types of spatial lags that can be used to explain the Settler effect. First, an endogenous spatial lag measure where whether the outcome in region I depends on the outcome of the other regions, J, or vice versa, resulting in the spatial autogressive model, the SAR model that appears, for instance, in several studies on the defense burden. Second, a spatial lag among the error terms might be appropriate if regions share similar unobserved characteristics or face a similar unobserved environments. Models that rely on this lag are known as spatial error models. However, they remain rather unpopular. Third, exogenous spatial lags can measure whether the outcome of region I depends on the explanatory variables of other regions if the number of explanatory variables is actually k. So according to the maximum number of lags of this type, the number of explanatory variables, which we previously said was k, so that the number of lags can also be k. So models containing these lags take the designation of the spatial lag of x. This is called SLX. Although exogenous spatial lags are widely used, they are less common in the context of spatial econometric models. In addition, what should basically what should be your takeaway from this particular slide of why is it important to actually consider spatial lags is that the biggest problem that we have in empirical spatial econometric research is actually to choose among different model specifications and metric specification. So the next slide will provide you an overview of spatial models. So here you see on the left-hand side the model, which is then the spatial autoregressive model, the error model, and the lag of X model, the autoregressive combined model, the spatial Durbin model, and the Durbin error model. So on the column 2, you see the spatial lags, where W is actually the neighborhood matrix multiplied with, for instance, in the first row, the dependent variable. So the restrictions, this is of a rather mathematical notation. However, the last column, column 4, says something about the flexibility and region spillovers, right? So these models are commonly used models in the spatial econometric literature. In particular, one limitation of the SEM model, the spatial error model in row number 2, is that it imposes restriction on the parameters. So the model selection criteria says that here the off-diagonal moments of the weighting matrix that actually define regional spillover effects are reduced to 0. So this model does not effectively measure any effect of any spillovers. So also the spatial autoregressive model in row number 1 and the spatial autoregressive combined model, the SAC, they do produce a proportional relationship between direct and indirect effects. So as a result, if for a certain variable the ratio of indirect to direct effect equals a certain number, then it equals this number for any other variables. So that is what it means with constant ratio. So from an empirical perspective, this behavior seems rather unlikely. Thus, only models that include an exogenous spatial lag, such as the spatial Durbin model and the spatial Durbin error model, so this is the last and the one before, that can take on different values for spillover relative to the direct effect across variables. So this basically is the qualitative rationale for using spatial Durbin models. On the next slide, I will introduce you a first basis for model selection, which is based on the spillovers. So here, there are several spillover effects. So spillover can actually be local or global. So in terms of assessing what kind of model actually is appropriate, we further consider the spatial Durbin, spatial error Durbin, because these models can take on different values for spillovers to the relative to the direct effect across variables. So let us further go into the model selection criteria based on the spillover effects on the next slide. So regional spillovers, and this is the core of the spatial regression techniques. So regional spillover can be, in effect, local or global. Local spillovers occur when regions are connected, such that the element of the weight matrix and a change in the explanatory variables in region I can affect the dependent variable in another region and vice versa. In contrast, global spillovers occur regardless of whether regions are actually connected. So therefore, a change to the explanatory variable of region I due to the spatial multiplier, this gets transmitted to all other countries or regions. So if we consider the current case, basically, if a military conflict occur between regions at the local level, this conflict can spread to regions across the continent, even if they are not directly involved in it. So then utilizing the spatial Durbin model makes sense due to its ability to capture global spillovers. So if regions do not get involved and the effects rather stay local, the spatial Durbin error model might be a more appropriate choice as it only captures local spillovers. So that being said, based on the global scale of World War II that set in motion ethnic cleansing campaigns and that connected very distant regions in several Soviet republics, the spatial Durbin model seems more appropriate to use over the spatial Durbin error model. It also appears to be the most robust one in the presence of doubts towards the reliability of the data at hand. So, long story short, what I do next on the next slide is I introduce you to the diagnostic dependency test that I did. So this is my step-by-step approach. So these are the tests. I'm starting with an OLS model. So this is a non-spatial model where I do not consider any spatial relationships, right? I run a test which is called the Lagrange multiplier test that is robust to the presence of spatial interaction. So this test, which is on the first row, is calculated based on the slope of the likelihood function at the observed values of the model variables. So applied to my OLS model, I find that both nulls of the spatial independence are rejected and that the model fit would significantly increase when adding an error or dependent spatial lag. So these are the first two rows. That being said, basically, I first run an OLS regression, not considering any spatial relationship. I test whether it makes sense to include them. So, and if both are actually rejected, I use a more robust one, and this is the likelihood ratio test. And the likelihood ratio test is done in order to confirm the spatial error model and the spatial lag model in favor of the spatial Durbin model. So, and in order to finalize this, so I found, long story short, basically that the likelihood ratio tests confirms the choice of the spatial Durbin models for all specification. However, I cannot be sure, so I have to compare the different spatial models and put them into comparison, and finally also test between the spatial Durbin error model and the spatial Durbin model by using Bayesian posterior model probabilities. Due to the timing, I refrained from explaining to this, but if you are interested, please send me an email. I can send you the extract of this project. So the next slide shows you how these Lagrange multiplier tests actually look like. So here you see two tables, one for employment and one for education, both for the sending regions. So the fitted model is actually a simple OLS model in both terms, which is basically the white collar employment as a function of the change in the settler variable and the change in the Jews. And the change, or basically, and controlling for other variables. So what you should be looking at is in the section tests under diagnostics, it says spatial error, spatial lag. So, and you see the robust Lagrange multiplier and in the spatial error section and the spatial lag section. So both have a p-value of 0, such that I need to basically include the spatial error or the spatial formulation in order to account for the data. So the presence of spatial autocorrelation is not surprising, as the former USSR actually covered about 1/4 of the world's landmass during its existence and included several semi-independent republics that were strongly interlinked financially and economically. So I do find that the null hypothesis of spatial lags in the error and the dependent variable is rejected at the 1% level in both the sending and the receiving regions. I'm showing here just the sending regions. However, in the appendix, I put in all test results. So on the next slide, I introduce you to the methodology that I use. So here's the following spatial Durbin model where I calculate the dependent variable, for which I take the logarithm, as a function of a constant term, as a function of a set of different settler variables that I already introduced you to, as a function of a set of covariates, and as a function of the spatial lags of the endogenous and the error term, and also not displayed here for the exogenous spatial lag. So on the next slide, I introduce you how to interpret the results basically. So on the slides to come, basically, you see two main results. You will see two main results. So the direct effect, and followed by it is a spillover effect. So the spillover effects are calculated only for the 1989 variables. Hence it says in the table description, late Soviet Union. Both tables actually allow me to assess not only the direct effects, but also the degree of spillovers from adjacent regions. Also, in the direct effects, basically, this contains rows and columns. Column 1 displays the model variables that I use. Column 2 to 4 and column 5 to 7 display the sending, respectively, the host regions. Sending and host regions further contain submodels according to year. This setting allows me to evaluate the existence and dissipation of effects. So, how to interpret the results? So, in this model, I take the logarithm of the dependent variable, for instance, white collar employment in 1959 or 1979. So the explanatory variable is then the change in the settler respective Jewish population. These are the two variables that I actually compare. And mathematically, this represents a change in the explanatory variable, which is to be interpreted as elasticity. So 1% change in the explanatory variable is associated with a change in the dependent variable, which is then more or less the coefficient. So as an example, so where we say basically elasticity, it's a 1% change in the explanatory variable, which is associated with a 1% increase, for instance, in the dependent variable. So a coefficient of 1.44 is calculated as the exponential of 0.044, which approximates 1.05. So this is a 5% change in the dependent variable. So a 1 unit change in the share of settler Jewish population, for instance, is associated with a 5% change in the dependent variable. So, on the next slide, I will introduce you to the white collar employment results from 1970 to 1989. So hopefully you can see the slide and the numbers. What you can see on column 2, 3, and 4 is basically in row 1 and 2. So this is the settler and the change in the Jewish population and the change in the settler population. You see basically for the regions of origin that only in 1970 the effect is statistically significant. So we can't rule out that this effect is actually 0. So the change in the percentage of settler population is an economic magnitude rather of lower importance, giving the effect of a lost significance. In 1979, 1989, we can actually argue that there is some dissipation effect, even comparing this with the region of origin in column 5, 6, and 7. You also see basically in magnitude in the regions of destination that the magnitude of 0.018 decreases gradually from 1970 to 1989. considering the change in the share of the Jewish community, we see that in magnitude, these results are much larger, right? Tenfold larger. However, they are not distinguishably from zero, which is indicated by the asterisks. Also, when we consider the region of destination, basically, here we do see the storyline of Hassan and Acemoglu confirmed, according to which a change in the number of Jews actually has a positive effect on white-collar employment. However, in the regions of destination, as you can also see from the graphs that I showed you, it is not associated with a drop because the Holocaust did not basically change the distribution of Jews in the entire Soviet Union. So they did not vanish entirely. So this is not associated with the drop. So the drop and the effects for the Holocaust is more or less in the regions of origin. So on the next slide, I will introduce you to the white-collar employment and the regional spillover for the late Soviet Union. So recall that in the previous slide, we simply saw the direct effect. So here's the spillover effect for white-collar employment in the Soviet Union. On the left-hand side, you have the regions of origin. On the right-hand side, you have the host regions. So in the first column, in the first row, you see the change in the percentage of settler population between 39 and 59. You still see that the direct effect and the indirect effect is significantly not important, and also in economic relevance rather of lower importance. The same holds true for the change in the percentage of Jewish population. There is no indirect effect, but this effect from 1989 is mostly direct. However, this changes when we consider the spillover effect for white-collar employment in the Soviet Union in the host regions. So in row number 1, table B, we see that the change in the share of the settler population is not positive, but actually negative, induced by an indirect effect of 0.014. This actually then results in a total effect of a negative minus 0.01 effect. So considering the change in the share of the Jewish population, we see that regions that actually have a higher share of a higher change in the share of Jews from 39 to 59 actually have a more positive white-collar employment. This is statistically significant at the 1% level. Here, there are no indirect effects that could actually decrease or increase the main effect, such that we have a 5% increase in the white-collar employment, which is statistically significant at the 1% level for the change in the Jewish community. On the next slide, I will introduce you to the results of the blue-collar employment from 1970 to 1989. Here is the same setting. So we have in row number 1 the change in the percentage of settler and the change in the percentage of Jewish population. The other variables like the Nazi occupation, Gulag level, latitude and longitude are not reported for space reason. Here we see again in the regions of origins that actually the change in the percentage of settler from 39 to 59 actually increases in negative magnitude, more or less from 0.05 to minus 0.007. Further, if we look at the change in the percentage of Jews in the region of origins, we see that these are, as in the settler case, indistinguishable from zero. So these basically results does not indicate any significant addition, for instance, or basically for the region of origins, that the change in the settler population, so these regions that actually experienced a drop in the settler population, had any long-run economic impact. This changes, however, when we consider the regions of origin. We see that a change in the settler population for the blue-collar employment is statistically highly significant at the 1% level for 1970 and decreases in the decades to come. So we see here an indication for dissipation effects. So so this effect has been present, but just the effect decay. So here for in row number 2, the change in the percentage of Jewish population, there is no significant and indistinguishable effect on blue-collar employment for regions that experienced a higher change in the share of Jews between 1970 and 1989. Also, for the blue-collar employment, the next slide will show you the spillover effect. So, for the spillover effects, basically, we see that in the regions of origin, here the change in the percentage of settler population, we have an indirect effect that actually makes the total effect negative at the which means basically 2% reduction in the blue-collar employment, but mostly induced by the indirect effect coming from neighboring regions. So in Table B, here we have the change in the share of the settlers between 1939 and 1959, and we see basically that the total effect is indistinguishable from zero. Here for the Jews in both tables, actually, there is no significant effect. The next slide will introduce you to the results of the tertiary education. And as expected, based on the study on Waldinger and Hassan, for instance, we see here that for the regions of destination, basically, which also hosted a lot of Jews in 59, basically, we see a highly significant effect of a change in the share of Jews that increased from 39 to 59 on the level of tertiary education. So this is highly significant at a 1% level. So regions that actually experienced, regions in Asia, Central Asia and Siberia that experienced a larger change, which is then basically an increase in the number of Jews in these regions, do have a significantly larger tertiary educational sector. This cannot be said for the addition of the settler population. But notice in the magnitude for the regions of destination that the magnitude actually gradually decreases over the period of 20 years from 1970 to 1989. So considering the spillover effect for tertiary education, this is the slide that shows you the spillover effect for the tertiary education in Table A for the regions of origins, and B for the regions that hosted settlers and that hosted settlers. So we see here no indirect and significant effect. So still the total effect in both ascending regions for the tertiary education is insignificant from zero. However, the results will change a bit when we look at the secondary education on the next hand slide. So here, for instance, we see here again then in row number 1 the change in the percentage of settler, and here in the change in the percentage of Jews. So What is significant here is only the regions of destination, where the change in the share of Jews actually produces a highly significant impact for secondary education, but only for the 1970 variable. Here also the variable decays. So the same is also true for the settler variables in the first row, being for the regions of destination that the magnitude actually was there, and we could actually see whether it was already there in 59. However, based on the data from 1970 to 1989, we see here also a decay in the magnitude, which suggests a dissipation of effects and basically this adjustment mechanism that took place already in 1970 onwards. So considering the spatial results or the spatial spillovers for the secondary education, here it is interesting for the regions that hosted the special settlers. Here we see an indirect effect actually making a total effect of almost 1% that would decrease the percentage of secondary educated people. This is, however, only significant at the 10% level, right? For the change in the number of Jews, basically, we find no indirect effect in both samples. So considering the effect for protests, and here it gets interesting, we see here the results for the region of origin and destination and the two variables that I used. I verbally explained that I also include data on the voting outcome on the preservation of the Soviet Union from March 1991, and also the number of protests in the late Soviet Union. And here it's very interesting, a drop in the change, or basically a change in the share of the settler from 1939 to 59, which is basically a drop in the share, is associated with a decreased protest activity of by almost 5%, and this is significant at the 5% level. So in the regions of destination, so here going to protests is not indistinguishable from zero. Being said, basically regions that hosted settlers, it is not the impact of the settler variables that would predict protesting. So, looking at the spillover effect, here we have the regions of origin and descending on the host regions again, and we see for the regions of origin that this result is actually driven very much by a huge indirect effect that actually translates into a very significant and highly significant total negative effect for regions that actually lost a significant share of their settler population. So they exhibit actually a significantly reduced protest activity. So in the host regions, we see that there's a total effect. However, this total effect of minus 0.019 in row number 1 is actually related to an indirect effect that comes from the change in the settler share. So these were a lot of tables. So let me quickly conclude here. So in this study, I investigated a historical episode that has not yet received much of attention in economic history. This is Stalin's ethnic cleansing campaign, and I put it into contrast with a narrative advocated by Hassan et al., which is basically the drop in the share of Jews produced a significantly smaller middle class and negatively affected the education. So I enriched the research by testing different spatial models against one another, and content-wise I focused on 3 questions. First, have the forced relocation campaign altered economic variables? And is the historical episode still felt today? And second, have effects vanished over time, such that an absence of any long-run effect would be subject to a post-treatment bias? So, and is there probably some kind of racism penalty that can be measured by exploiting the temporal variation in the rehabilitation status? Just for the sake of completeness, I didn't show you the split by the temporal rehabilitation status. So this is just the overall. Have there been settlers? Haven't there been settlers? So the effects for human, capital, and social strata in the sandy regions dissipated over roughly 3 decades. This is one conclusion. So the mechanism of an adjusted valuation of education towards higher aspiration is not really confirmed. So regions that experienced a massive decline in the share of its settlers' population between 1939 and 1959 show a significantly reduced protest activity. So overall, the evidence speaks to a deliberately untapped labor market and educational potential. So it reveals basically that receiving regions, actually, they missed a great chance of having integrated an economically successful population, and this is basically of the utmost importance considering recent migration waves from the Middle East to let them free educate their children and free move, and So this is the main takeaway. So they basically numbed a lot of punished people, and they weren't able to realize their true potential. So this is my takeaway from this study, and I would like to introduce the discussion, which would then say, to what degree does this project actually work relate to your existing knowledge in the discipline? And have I missed some critical points in my argument or the underlying assumptions? Or do you evaluate the data and methodology I use to pursue my goal as valid? So please be assured that, first of all, actually, you do formulate a hypothesis. So this can be right or wrong. So therefore, this is the overall research process. Unfortunately, I didn't find at the moment the results that I hoped I find. However, I'm pretty sure that they're there, and I am very grateful for any additional data points that you can draw my attention to. So thank you very much for listening. Shoot me an email should you want to discuss this any further. So in the coming slides, as I said, I posted some additional appendix material. So this is also the change in the settler population based on another chloropleth map. Here, for instance, you see the regions that are red are now the regions that have a more crowded settler population. So here, the change in the number of Jews. And here also, again, the different test stats that you can use. I also put in a button in order to get you back to that here, also for the host regions. So thank you very much for your attention. It was a great pleasure being with you, and take care.